Here we go. All right. Hi, everyone. I am here with Alexia Salvatierra and Scott Cormode from Fuller Theological Seminary. Hi, Alexia. Hi, Scott. How are you doing?
Hi, Markus. Fine.
I'm really glad to have you here. This is sort of the first episode of the podcast, kind of looking at the church after COVID. And so I'm excited to have this conversation with you. Well, let me invite each of you just to introduce each other. Introduce yourselves briefly. Scott, tell us briefly what you do.
Sure. My name is Scott Cormode. I am a professor of leadership at Fuller Seminary. And I think part of the reason that we're having this conversation is I've just finished a book that came out in September called The Innovative Church, that's specifically on the question of how do churches respond to large social change.
Yeah, that's a big one. Okay, good. Perfect. And then Alexia, tell us about yourself.
Sure. So I'm Alexia Salvatierra, and I'm the assistant professor of integral mission and global transformation, which is a little bit of a strange title, I admit. And I have a couple of other hats that I am what we call the madrina, which is the godmother. It's very ominous sounding.
Okay, yeah.
It's not. It's much warmer in the Latinx context, but of something called Matthew 25, Mateo 25, which is a network of immigrant and non-immigrant churches, mostly evangelical, and Puentes, who are bilingual, bicultural millennials in Southern California. So we come together to stand with and accompany and advocate for immigrant families facing detention and deportation. So I wear that hat as well.
Wow, cool. Good. Well, let me ask each of you a couple of little get to know you questions. And so the first question I want to ask is, what job would you be terrible at? Alexia.
So I am hopeless about anything mechanical. I mean, laughably, ridiculously hopeless. I could tell you horrible stories. I gave my father enormous grief. He always thought I was doing it on purpose, but I wasn't.
Okay. And let me ask you the other question as well. We'll kind of do both of them for each. So Alexia, when do you feel truly alive?
I had two very different reactions to that question, Markus. I guess I'll just give them both. I love to dance. I was a professional dancer when I was young, and really, I used to say that I wish that all the social problems were solved so I could just dance. Because I always had a sense of call to justice. And so but the other thing is, I was thinking that part of why I'm excited to be at Fuller is I love the moment when a student gets it. When something comes together and it's like their life is changed and their ministry expands and their sense of mission expands. And it's just a light bulb moment. And I just love that.
That's awesome. I love that too when I'm preaching and I see somebody's eyes go, oh, yeah.
Yes, they widen, don't they? The eyes widen. Absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. Scott, let me ask you those same two questions. The first one is, what job would you be terrible at?
Well, I would be terrible at being anything that requires musical ability, a singer, a conductor, that kind of thing. I'm both tone deaf and have no sense of rhythm. My daughter is a vocalist, and she finally, when she was in high school, said, no, Dad, you can't be tone deaf. And so we sat down at the piano, and half an hour later, she just stood up and said, fine, you're hopeless, and walked away. So, it's comical.
And so you're saying you were not a dancer in your earlier life?
No, I really am not. And I'm married to one. And so, she is. There are many things my wife has had to endure in being married to me, and one of them is the fact that I am not a very good dance partner.
Oh, that's awesome. All right, the second question then. When do you feel truly alive?
Well, it's funny because I was just thinking about this the other day because it's the 1-year anniversary of the last time I played basketball. I am in my 50s, and I still, up until COVID, was playing 2 or 3 times a week. And when I play, the world just disappears. And I just use a different part of my brain. And, it would be, I love that. But one of the things that is the other thing that's, I actually love my job. And one of the things we did a couple of years ago is we reinvented how to teach online. So it's much more communal. And I have just finished a quarter where I taught on Zoom. I have never had a better quarter teaching. Now, every other person I know is like, oh, it has been because the class was so communal and the students broke into groups of 8. They got to the point where they were saying, this is the community that I can have when I can't have any other community. And so I had literally students in Costa Rica and Central Poland and Taipei and Madagascar connecting to students here in Pasadena and Columbus, Ohio, and Seattle, Washington. And there was just a deep connection, enough so that at least half of my groups are going to continue next quarter. And there's something deeply satisfying about combining education with the Christian practice of koinonia.
Yeah. That's one of the, well, we're going to talk about church after COVID today, but also just sort of the experience of COVID. And for me, one of the surprising things has been you can actually have relationships this way. Maybe not as ideal as if we were sitting in the same room together, but there is still something there, right? We're still 2 human beings or more in relationship. And there's something really good about that, even if it's like this, which is awesome. Hey, I just want to share it with our audience as well, Scott, that I love having this conversation with you because, as I mentioned, you were, to you personally, right? You were my CPM liaison, Committee on Preparation for Ministry, back when I was preparing to be a pastor, and I'm very grateful for that because you don't know what I went through. It took me a lot of mental and emotional energy to finally say yes to being a pastor, but you played a part in that. And, I don't remember any of the articles, you were a leadership professor back then too. I don't remember the articles you had me read, but I remember that you stayed in touch. And even when I felt like, I have to go meet with my liaison, right? The fact that you stayed in touch and helped me to get through it meant a lot to me. And so, anyway, thank you. 18 or 19 years later.
I'm so
just wanted to say that. Yeah. Well, so let's talk about this. Let's start. You guys work in some other contexts besides Fuller. You work with some churches. Tell us about the kinds of churches that you typically work with. Who wants to go first? Scott, you go first this time.
I think it's you next. Oh, or either way, because Scott's going to go first on the substantial stuff. So okay, I'll go first on this one.
Okay.
So I work with a lot of different churches, but my primary focus over the last couple of years has been Spanish-speaking churches. I also run something called the Diplomado, which is a professional certificate for Spanish-speaking pastors and pastoral leaders at Fuller. So I work with a lot of Spanish-speaking churches. And then the churches of the second generation, which are mostly multicultural, a lot of church plants. So those are the churches that I've been working with most closely over the last couple of years.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Good. And then Scott, what have you
I do a lot of work with the Fuller Youth Institute. So we have a number of conferences each year where we gather church teams, usually groups of 3 or 4 leaders who will come and work on questions around anything dealing with youth and young adults. But then I've been working on this project on innovation for the last 5 years. In 2015, I wrote a manuscript on church innovation. What does it take? The question that we were asking is, how do you maintain a rock-solid commitment to the unchanging Christian gospel while at the same time create an innovative or entrepreneurial spirit for presenting that gospel to an ever-changing culture? So a never-changing gospel for an ever-changing culture. We wrote that in 2015 and then spent the next 4 or 5 years road testing it. We've worked with about 100 different congregational teams through the Fuller Youth Institute. We've had 3 different parallel projects, one called Youth Ministry Innovation, one called Young Adult Ministry Innovation, and one on innovation for vocation. And then last summer, or the summer of 19, I rewrote the whole manuscript based on what we had learned. And just as I was reading the page proofs, COVID became the thing. And all of a sudden, all these churches that had been trying to develop, how do we figure out how to ride the next wave, were being swamped by all these things that they had not expected. And so much of how I see COVID and the post-COVID world is through these questions we were asking about how do you maintain a never-changing gospel in an ever-changing culture, even when the culture is changing in ways that you would never have guessed. So that's kind of how I see COVID coming.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. And it's I think this will be a really interesting conversation, different kinds of contexts that each of you work in, and it'll be interesting to see some of the similarities and some of the differences, and whatever we can learn from each other, I think is going to be awesome. So let me just ask you, what do you think is the biggest lesson that the church has learned from this year of COVID, from your experience and with the folks that you're working with? What have we learned?
Well, one of the things that I would say is the biggest thing that we have learned is that nobody knows what's around the next corner. For 10 years, maybe, well, almost 20 years now, I've been quoting an author who talks about how seminary education is designed for theological camels. We pump people with enough knowledge and send them out into the desert and hope that they can find their way to an oasis. And when I was in seminary, no one talked to me about the internet. The reason they didn't talk to me about the internet was because the internet, as we know it, wasn't invented till 6 months after I graduated. But my Fuller education prepared me for the internet. It prepared me for a world because it taught me to be agile. And so the number one thing that we have learned is that preparation makes you agile. There's all things we can do, all the sorts of things we can do to prepare, but they're not, well, let's use a dance analogy, okay? That there's different ways in talking about dance. There is choreography, where you learn steps, and no matter what happens, you have a predictable song and a predictable group of people around you, and you follow those steps. When Alexia goes out dancing, when she enjoys it and has a wonderful time, she's probably not choreographed. She's adapting to the music and to the people around her, and she's inventing the steps as she goes along. But she's not really inventing the steps. She's calling on all this learning that she has, all this stuff that she has that is in her person. Preparation makes you agile. And one of the things that the church has done for years is thought preparation teaches you to do the same thing over and over again. And we need to know that preparation doesn't do that. Preparation teaches you how to be agile. And you need to learn a different way of experiencing preparation in order to have the agility to meet the world. Because the thing about COVID is not about COVID. It's, okay, COVID is the next thing after whatever happened with the crash of 2008, or the invention of the smartphone, or 9/11, or whatever is the other thing that has happened in the last few years that we have. Think about the smartphone. The smartphone has completely changed how we think about basic things like community. Yet you would never know that from looking at the fact that churches are still practicing the way that they were 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. We're going to have to figure out how to adopt methods of agility. And that's really what I'm interested in. That's what we figured out from COVID is that you cannot prepare for a world that you don't know when you don't know what's around the next corner. All you can do is prepare to be agile.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Agility. And I feel kind of sort of maybe going along with that. It was a lesson in letting go of some of the rules, I think. I got my communion cup right there because I did communion here every month for most of last year, and that didn't fit the rules that we had in place in the Book of Order, but that was a type of agility that we had to engage in terms of how do we still be the church, even though we can't be the church the same way. Alexia, let me turn to you. What do you think is the biggest lesson that the church has learned from your experience?
Right. Listening to both of you and also thinking about my own context, I thought about what I've heard is that the Chinese character for crisis is opportunity and danger. So certainly for Spanish-speaking churches, the initial experience with COVID pushed them right up against the lack of access to technology. And that, certain kinds of technology, most people have access to. Most people have access to WhatsApp and a smartphone, and some level of smartphone. But using technology in a church context was just not normal. Now, it was normal for second generation, for the young people, very normal. For them, it was, not the same kind of challenge. But for Spanish-speaking immigrant pastors, the initial reaction was horror. And then three amazing things happened. The first thing that happened was that they did start using technology. And so now they do. Like the diplomado, they were professional certificates and online program. We have 40 people taking it this time. It's like, yeah, they're using it now. The second thing that happened was that not everybody had bandwidth to get a service on the technology that was available to them. So what happened is that 2 or 3 families would gather regularly in a house together. And so it just multiplied leaders like crazy, because somebody out of those 3 families would become the leader. So suddenly you had like 20 times as many leaders in a congregation. So that was this amazing and wonderful thing that happened. And then the third thing that happened was there's this very ambivalent relationship. It's a relationship with a lot of tension between the immigrant generation and the subsequent generations. So we often say that our puentes, our bilingual, bicultural millennials, are at the margins of both the dominant culture churches, or the English-speaking churches, and the Spanish-speaking churches. They're at the margins of 2 different sets of churches. But suddenly they became important to their parents and grandparents because they could solve the technology problems, and their parents and grandparents couldn't. Yeah. So suddenly they went from being, and that's what we try to do with puentes. Their identity becomes a vocation. Puente means bridge. So instead of being at the margins, they suddenly become central because they're needed as a bridge. So it changed the relationship between generations in a number of churches, which also, then runs into the whole set of assumptions that people hold rigidly. So I'm not saying it's a smooth process. Yeah. I'm saying that it's a beautiful struggle. Yeah. It's a beautiful struggle.
Yeah. Disruption is never smooth, right? That's awesome. I love it. It's so interesting, the unexpected blessings, so to speak, that come from these kinds of things, like those who were not necessarily at the center of the life of the church now all of a sudden finding their place in it, and anyway, that's great. So those are some of the things that have happened over the past year. The question that everybody's asking is what's it going to look like after, when we get through? What is going to stick? What's not going to stick? What do you guys think will change so that the church can thrive as we move forward? Alexia, why don't you go first?
So, we don't know how much of the gains that have been made will last. Nobody really knows when the pressure isn't on in the same way. But we have a whole other issue in our community, which is that I experience COVID very differently in my Spanish-speaking circles and my English-speaking circles. In my Spanish-speaking circles, it's a plague. The numbers of people that have died are much higher than the numbers of people that have died in white contexts. And not only the numbers, but the way that they died. That people died unnecessarily and unjustly. They died from not being able to get access to care soon enough. There is a great awakening movement in the Hispanic community in Latin America and in the United States, but it's very Pentecostal. And it's not that people aren't able to deal with the injustices and pains of life, because that is our daily reality, but that there's just been so much, it's been an in-your-face experience of pastors dying, of everybody praying their hearts out, and the pastor dies. And so there's going to be a sort of second level grief that everybody's going to have to deal with. It's like when the crisis is over, when the crisis is going on, it's emergency time. When the crisis is over, the grief is going to hit really deep. And so our pastoral leaders are going to need to know how to somehow live with our Pentecostal experience, but walk people through this kind of collective grief, this collective multiplying, echoing grief that we're facing. So, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. And that's not something that I had really thought about yet, but you're right. Usually we think about what are the routines we're going to maintain? What are the, technologies? But yeah, that the grief. And I feel like we need to talk about the differences between the contexts, the Latinx context and the white context. But we could probably go really deep on that. But it's absolutely worth noting at least that exists. Scott, what are your thoughts on that? Maybe in response to what Alexia shared, or just in addition, what will need to change as we move forward?
I'd love to. I'm very excited about hearing Scott's wisdom on some of this.
So what's really interesting, I've appeared on a lot of podcasts in the last 6 or 8 months where they ask the same question. And they say, what's going to happen when we go back? And I reframe the question as what's next? Because I want to argue that before we can get back to our routine, there's going to be an interim period of what's next. And my answer sounds an awful lot like what Alexia's answer was. So that's really interesting to me. What I would the phrase that I use again and again is we have to talk about grief and gratitude. And the way that I would say it is we have to learn to pray or learn to talk to God the way the Psalms talk to God. About 40% of the Psalms are Psalms of lament. And probably about half the Psalms are Psalms of praise. And if I were in a position where I could dictate what people should do in their worship services, and it's very clear to me I'm not, but if I could, I would say that every worship service for the foreseeable future needs to have moments of grief and moments of gratitude, moments of lament where we use the Psalms of lament, and moments of praise where we thank God for what we have, because we live in this odd crashing between grief and gratitude that every one of us has experienced grief because of COVID. And most of us can look around and say, there are things that I am grateful for, that at least I have a roof over my head, or at least I have, whatever it is that we can think about. And we live in this tension. And somehow the church has accidentally taught us that we can feel either grief or we can feel gratitude, but we rarely feel them at the same time. Yet the real difficulty that many of the Christians that I know are experiencing is if they feel grief, they think, oh, no, I'm supposed to say, I want to say, be thankful to God. Or if they feel ingratitude, they go, no, I gotta feel grief with in solidarity with others. And they feel this kind of sense of churning. When in fact, the Psalms are designed to do just exactly both of those things. They're designed to say, the message of the Psalms of Lament is God can handle your honesty, even and especially when you're angry at God. And many, many, many of our churches, whether Pentecostal or traditional Presbyterian or what, are taught you're not allowed to be angry at God. Well, the only way you're not allowed to be angry at God is you don't read the Psalms. John Goldingay, who is one of the top 5 Old Testament scholars in the world. You can debate on what order they're in, but he's going to be one of the top 5. Here is his definition of the Psalms of Lament. It is the people of God shaking their fist at God and saying, God, you promised it wouldn't be this way. We need to be able to teach our people to have that kind of honesty before God as a way that we do together. Because then it can have the kind of honest relationship that the Psalms cry out for us to have. So we can talk later about what kind of routines and all that stuff. But if you ask what's next is a deep sense of grief and gratitude together in a way that people find deeply disconcerting.
And I think I would add a third G, which is guilt. That the people in my context whose parents didn't die because they were able to pull something off for them, that those people have a deep sense of survivor guilt. And so it's like, how do we come to before God with that, with all of that mess, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and part of what you're talking about is we have to have a sense of privilege. For example, I'm a white guy, and the reaction that my wife and I had to COVID is we just stayed home. We sat in our house with our good bandwidth and did all of our work. And because my parents are at risk, the only time I would go out is literally on Wednesdays. I drive up to Ventura where they live, and I would check on them and make sure they hadn't gone out during the week, and that my siblings and I would bring them their groceries. And other than going to the doctor, they didn't go out. There's a level of privilege that allows that to happen. And, a lot of the people that you're talking about, Alexia, didn't have that as one of their options because the jobs and the things that they needed to support their families required them to be at risk in a way that my job allowed me just to kind of hunker down and wait for it all to be over.
Yeah. And then people also, you're so right, Scott. And then people also live in extended families in smaller houses. And so very hard to protect yourself. I was just thinking that I left out earlier something really beautiful that happened, at least in one church, but I think it was more than one, which is that the bonds between people actually got stronger because they did a documented family took on an undocumented family because they were about half and half. And the documented families had access to cares, to the different kinds of benefits, and the undocumented families did not. Not even unemployment, obviously. So, so they did, pairs, family pairs. And that had never happened, right? And it was extremely, from my perspective, just beautiful and life-giving what they did. But,
right.
I think it's, yeah.
Yeah. Well, so what comes to mind for me is caring for the alien and the stranger, right? And this experience leading to an expression of that call, right? That's cool. So we've kind of touched then already on kind of the spiritually formative part of this experience. Then as we move forward, so helping our people experience gratitude and grief and move through the guilt in a healthy way. How do we? I guess the question is, what kinds of qualities would pastors and other leaders need in order to be the kind of leader that they need to be as we move towards this post-COVID period?
So let me start with, anytime anybody asks me about leadership, I'm going to have the same opening answer. And that is, leadership begins with listening. We tend to think that leadership is about what you say. But it needs to begin with a particular kind of listening, a kind of empathetic listening. The purpose of empathetic listening is not the effect that it has on the person that you're listening to. It's the effect that it has on the hearer. The purpose of empathetic listening is for me to be transformed by transporting myself to the place that to the people that I'm listening to. And so I have two choices. I can either engage in empathetic listening, or I can treat people like a stereotype. And one of the things that's happened going for this last year is that everyone's had their own experience. I was just talking to a pastor that I've been mentoring who lives in Texas. And a couple of weeks ago, you may have heard, Texas froze over and everybody was blocked in their houses. And he said, every time I meet with a parishioner now, before we can have any conversation of anything, the first question is, what was what was your experience of the blizzard? And they need to tell their story. He said, I've met with the same elder 3 times in the last 2 weeks. And each time he needed to tell me the same story. And it is something that has to come out. And so the first thing that we need is listening. And once we begin to do that, what we're listening for is how the human condition, how people experienced why it's hard to be human during the midst of COVID. And the reason that we need to do that is because our second big task is to make spiritual sense of those longings and losses. The gospel is God's response to the human condition. But the thing of it is, we don't know how our people are experiencing the human condition unless we do some deep and empathetic listening. I was talking to a pastor just in the last couple of days who has decided to give up the parish. And part of the reason is that he said, I don't want to do the listening. I don't want to have to, I'm at retirement age and I don't want to have to retool myself. And if I'm going to speak and listen and preach to the next generation, I'm going to have to understand them in a new, and it's time. And it's just exhausting. And we have to recognize that in the midst of saying you must listen and you make spiritual sense, at the same time, every pastor I know is exhausted. They've been carrying the pandemic on their back for a year. And so we have this part of it where the temptation is going to be to hunker down and to crawl into bed and pull the covers over your head and say, okay, I just need a break until after summer, and then we'll start in the fall. And then on the flip side of that, the most important thing we can do is just spend an enormous amount of time listening, which requires just exactly the kind of social endurance that many of our pastors don't have right now. And so it's a particularly tricky moment for our pastors, because the needs of the moment and the resources, the energy that they have right now are often pushing in very opposite directions.
Yeah, that's good. That's great listening. Alexia, what kinds of qualities do you think leaders will need moving out of this COVID era?
This is very timely, because I'm just finished teaching a pastoral theology course in Spanish at Fuller. It's my second time teaching that course. And, they, in their final papers, they were talking about what they had found most valuable. And of course, this whole course was happening during COVID, right? So what had they found most valuable?
Yeah.
And Scott is spot on that way up there in the top 4 was, Henry Nouwen's Wounded Healer, The Art of Active Listening. Like those were way up there.
Mm-hmm.
But actually the number 1, and one of the pastoras, she wrote it in caps. The whole sentence. She said, paying attention to what the Holy Spirit is already doing. Paying attention. So, Mark Lau Branson talks about this all the time, right? He's a broken record at Fuller, and God's agency. But really, this was critical. Like God is already at work in our communities, in our churches, in our families. And as a leader, I need to pay attention. And of course, if you don't listen, and if you don't make spiritual sense, you can't see what God is doing. But for them, that was just tremendously encouraging to remember that, to train themselves to see that, to see the movement of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. I love that, right. Both kinds of listening to each other and listening to the Holy Spirit, paying attention to each other, paying attention to the Holy Spirit, which requires some ability to step back, maybe, right? And what do they say? Get on the balcony a little bit, right? Get on the balcony.
Yeah, they love that part.
Anyway, right?
And subir al balcón. They all love that.
Oh,
yeah.
Wait, who loved that? What was that?
The Spanish-speaking pastors in the class is I just said it in Spanish. Get on the balcony, subir al balcón. But they also, that was in the top 5 too, because they loved that of all of the high-fit stuff, the adaptive leadership stuff. That was the phrase that they liked. They liked that phrase. Getting on the balcony.
Yeah. That's awesome. So, this has been really good. What about you guys? How have you been formed, would you say? What are some things that God has done in your life over this past year?
Is it my turn yet? No, I got lost.
Sure. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So this has been, so I just became tenure track full-time faculty on July 1st at Fuller. Before that, I had been an affiliate at Fuller for a number of years. But I was also teaching at a variety of other seminaries and doing lots of other things, pastoring also. So, and I was traveling about 4 times a month, literally 4 times a month on airplanes before COVID.
Wow.
If COVID had not happened, this is going to sound terrible, but it was a great grace for me because I never could have done this job. I never could have made all the shifts necessary to do this job if I had not been forced to stay in my house, right? Because part of what it means to be a professor is to spend a lot of time researching and writing. And honestly, I just would not have done it. So it's been a monastic experience for me in that sense. That you think of the monks reading and writing, only you think of them using quills, but anyhow, but really
right.
in that sense of, okay, I'm in my house. I have lots of interactions on Zoom, like Scott was talking. I don't mind teaching online because, you can have lots of amazing interactions with people around the world. But yeah, sitting in my kitchen the whole time and not being on airplanes, it gives you a lot of time, and not being in the car driving 2 hours to get to the Inland Empire. It gives you a lot of time to research and write. I would not have had that time. And I think my prayer life has also changed, because I'm not rushing around. So I have much more of a constant awareness of God. But so I would say that. But I think that my father dying without us really being able to be with him, he didn't die of COVID. He died from other causes, but we couldn't go in and be with him while he was dying. And that was really awful. That's like long-lasting scars. So it hasn't been all good by any means, but there's certainly been a gift in it for me. Although that gift, again, I experience it as privilege. I have family members that are essential workers. So I live alone, but that's not true of them. So.
Yeah. Oh. Scott, how have you been formed over this past year?
Well, part of the reason that grief and gratitude has become so important to me is I realized at the beginning of the pandemic that was my spiritual discipline, at least for many months, was to be able to feel the two things at once. I could feel one or I could feel the other, but I'd always feel the pull in the other direction. And the more I read the Psalms, the more I realized that kind of dual experience was part of what it means to be human. We are to weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice, and we're to do it every day. And before the pandemic, it was easy for me to say my job was, well, I could do some rejoicing, I could do some weeping, but mostly just live whatever I was feeling. And to feel what others have been feeling and to bring both the grief and the gratitude to God each day has been a significant part of my discipline. And then the other is, I'm somebody who accomplishes things. I do stuff. I don't travel as much as Alexia, but I travel a lot. I do things. And I'm not doing any of that now. But what have I done is every Wednesday I've been driving up and seeing my parents and spending the day caring for them and, cooking dinner and cleaning the house and those kinds of things. And there is something that I am grateful for because, my dad's in the midst of dying. He's not there yet, but, he's in intensive care right now. And we think he'll get out, but it's just been our experience this year. And so I've felt this tremendous sense of attachment to something that is just very human. And I've tried to make a point of reading the things I read about other people and their families and all the ways in which COVID has been experienced by people through the compassion, through the empathy that comes with just being in touch with the lives of loved ones. And every one of us has loved ones and we experience them in very different ways. But being in touch with those things has been a significant part of my spiritual discipline this year.
Yeah. Wow. thank you. Let me just say, as we wrap up, thank you so much to both of you. I love that you've both been so honest, even about your own experience here, right? And I think that's really meaningful. So thank you for the work that each of you are doing, and for the way that you're leading and teaching, and helping people navigate these times in your own ways and in your own contexts. And anyway, thanks for this conversation too. I feel blessed by it, and so yeah, thank you. All right, cut. Good. That was great. Hey, thank you so much. I'm going to hit stop.